As spring slowly settled over the small town, the land around the old train car turned green again. The air was fresh, the days were longer, and the once lonely piece of land didn't feel so empty anymore. Ethan had already spent months cleaning and repairing the car's body, but he knew the real work was only beginning. What he had so far was a shell, a clean one, but still empty, cold, and lifeless inside. Now it was time to give it a soul. He stood at the doorway one morning, coffee in hand, staring into the hollow space. The metal walls echoed every sound, and the floor still smelled faintly of dust and oil. He imagined a small kitchen here, a cozy bed there, maybe even a place to sit by the window and watch the sunset. The image in his mind was clear. All he had to do was make it real. But making it real wasn't going to be easy. He didn't have much money left after buying the car and the land. Every screw, board, and pipe would have to come from somewhere cheap, or better yet, free. So he began visiting junkyards, construction sites, and secondhand stores. He asked around for leftover materials. Some people were generous and gave him old wooden planks or unused tiles. Others thought he was strange but admired his determination. He'd load his small pickup truck with whatever he could find and bring it back to the train car. Bit by bit, he gathered enough to start working on the interior. The first step was to deal with the insulation. The winters had nearly frozen him out, and he wasn't going to live through another one like that. So he spent days measuring, cutting, and fitting recycled insulation panels along the walls. It was messy work, full of dust and sweat, but it felt good to see progress. When the first section of the wall was covered, he stepped back and smiled. It wasn't pretty yet, but it finally looked like a place where someone could live. He worked long hours, often into the night. Sometimes, a single light bulb hanging from a wire was the only thing glowing for miles. If you drove by then, you might see a shadow moving inside the train car, hammering, sawing, or painting. People in town started calling him the train man. Some said it jokingly, others with a bit of respect. A few curious kids would ride their bikes out to the property and watch from a distance. One afternoon, a boy shouted, "Hey, mister, are you really going to live in that thing?" Ethan laughed and said, "I already do." The kids giggled and pedaled away, but they kept coming back every few days to see what had changed. Little by little, the space began to take shape. The old steel floor was covered with smooth wooden panels he'd sanded by hand. The walls, once cold and gray, were lined with reclaimed timber that gave the place warmth. He found a small second-hand stove and installed it near one corner, imagining how nice it would feel to sit beside it on cold nights. He didn't rush anything. Every piece of wood, every screw, every nail had its place. This wasn't just construction, it was therapy. Every time he built something new, he felt himself rebuilding too. There were setbacks, of course. The wiring turned out to be a nightmare. He tried to fix it himself but ended up blowing a fuse. One night the power went out completely, leaving him in total darkness. He sat there, surrounded by half-finished walls, feeling frustrated and defeated. It would have been easy to give up right then. But after sitting quietly for a while, listening to the sound of the wind outside, he took a deep breath and reminded himself why he started. He wasn't doing this to impress anyone or to prove a point. He was doing it because he needed to, because starting over meant creating something with his own two hands, even if it took time. The next day, he drove to the local hardware store and asked the clerk for advice. The man recognized him right away. "You're the guy with the train car, right?" he asked with a grin. Ethan nodded. "That's me." "Well," the clerk said, leaning on the counter, "most folks thought you were crazy. But I've seen what you're doing out there. It's coming along." He showed Ethan a few affordable ways to fix the wiring properly and even offered a discount on some parts. That simple act of kindness lifted Ethan's spirits more than he expected. Over the next few weeks, he kept working steadily. He added small windows that opened toward the east, letting in the morning light. He built shelves from old pallets, turning them into places to store his books and tools. He crafted a foldable table that could be used for eating or working. Every addition made the space feel more alive. By the time summer came, the once empty train car had transformed into something almost magical. Inside, it was cool and shaded, with soft light spilling through the windows. The scent of wood filled the air. Outside, wildflowers grew around the base, softening the harsh edges of metal. He even built a small wooden deck at the entrance, using leftover planks. It wasn't perfect. Some boards were uneven, but it gave him a place to sit with his morning coffee and watch the sunrise. Sometimes the same kids who had laughed before would stop by again. They didn't laugh anymore. One of them said, "It looks nice now." That small comment meant more to Ethan than they could have known. Still, most people didn't understand his project. When he went into town for supplies, he'd overhear people talking. Some still called it foolish. "Who'd want to live in a train car?" one man said at the cafe. Another replied, "Guess he's just one of those weird dreamers." But there were a few who started to see it differently. One afternoon, a local reporter showed up after hearing about the man turning an old train into a home. She asked if she could take a few pictures and write a small story for the local paper. Ethan hesitated at first, not wanting attention. But then he thought maybe sharing his journey could inspire someone else who felt stuck or hopeless. The article came out the next week with the title, "From Rust to Renewal, a Local Man's Unusual Home Project." The photos showed the before and after contrast, the decaying metal shell versus the warm, glowing interior. The story spread quickly, and for the first time people didn't laugh. They admired it. Some even came by to ask questions about how he did it. Ethan didn't see himself as special. He just smiled and told them the truth. You'd be surprised what you can build when you stop worrying about what other people think. As the months went on, he continued improving the place. He built a small sleeping loft using leftover beams from an old barn. He added solar panels on the roof that powered his lights and small appliances. And he designed the layout so every inch of space had a purpose. At night, when the air cooled and crickets sang outside, he'd sit on his deck with a lantern beside him, reading or sketching ideas for what to build next. Sometimes he thought about the life he used to have, the house, the job, the routine. It all seemed so far away now, like it belonged to someone else. This train car, this patch of land, this simple, quiet life. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. He had started with nothing but rust and a dream, and now he had a home taking shape before his eyes. It wasn't finished yet, but neither was he. The people who once laughed no longer mocked him when they drove by. They'd slow down, look at the lights glowing softly through the train windows, and maybe even smile. Some would wave. What they saw now wasn't a crazy man living in junk. It was someone who had turned something forgotten into something beautiful. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, his project was about to draw attention far beyond his little town. But for now, he was content with the sound of the evening breeze and the creak of wood beneath his feet, a reminder that progress, no matter how slow, was still progress. Every nail he hammered, every wall he built was more than construction. It was a story of patience, healing, and quiet determination. The rusty train car that once stood as a joke was slowly becoming a home filled with warmth, light, and life. And though he had come a long way, Ethan knew this was only the beginning of something even greater. Summer came to an end and the days slowly began to cool. The wildflowers around the train car faded, replaced by tall grass swaying in the wind. By now, Ethan's project had become part of the town's story. People no longer saw it as an eyesore. It was something to be curious about, something people admired from a distance. Ethan's little home was far from finished, but it already had a soul. Inside, the smell of fresh wood mixed with the faint scent of coffee. Light streamed through the new windows, painting soft patterns on the floor. When you stepped inside, it didn't feel like a train anymore. It felt like a home, simple, warm, and peaceful. But while the place looked beautiful on the surface, Ethan knew there was still a lot left to do. The plumbing needed work, the kitchen wasn't complete, and he dreamed of adding a small workspace at the far end of the car. His savings were running low, and every improvement required creativity and patience. He'd wake up early each morning, make a cup of coffee on his small stove, and write down what he needed to get done that day. The list was always long: cut wood, fix leaks, build shelves, seal cracks, repaint the roof. Yet somehow, crossing off even one task gave him a deep sense of pride. On weekends, he visited flea markets and secondhand shops, searching for furniture that fit his vision. He didn't want anything fancy, just things with character. He found an old wooden chair with a broken leg, which he repaired and polished until it looked brand new. He discovered a small iron lamp that he rewired himself. Slowly, piece by piece, his home came alive with stories. Each object had a past, just like he did. Sometimes, when he sat at night reading by that little lamp, he'd think about how far he'd come. It wasn't long ago that people laughed at him for buying a rusted train car. But now the same people stopped by to see his progress. One afternoon, a couple from town came by with a basket of muffins. They introduced themselves and said, "We've been following your story in the paper. We just wanted to see it in person." They walked through the train car, amazed by how cozy it felt. "It's incredible," the woman said softly, touching the smooth wooden wall. "I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself." Ethan smiled, a bit shy but proud. "Thank you," he said. "It's still a work in progress, but I'm getting there." After they left, he stood outside for a long time, watching the sunlight bounce off the roof. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel broken. He felt seen for what he'd created, not for what he'd lost. But progress didn't come without challenges. As autumn arrived, heavy rainstorms hit the area. The old metal roof, despite his repairs, began to leak again. Water dripped through tiny cracks, soaking the floor and ruining part of the wooden panels. He spent hours trying to fix it, climbing up in the rain, tightening bolts and sealing gaps. By the time he climbed down, he was soaked and exhausted. That night, he sat inside listening to the steady sound of rain against the roof. It wasn't a peaceful sound anymore. It was a reminder of how fragile his creation still was. For the first time in a while, doubt crept back in. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe turning an old train car into a home wasn't meant to work, but giving up wasn't an option. He had come too far for that. The next morning, when the rain stopped, he went outside and inspected every inch of the roof. He made notes, found stronger materials, and spent the next few days fixing every problem he could find. When the next storm came, not a single drop got through. That small victory meant everything. The change in weather also brought something new: color. The trees around the property turned shades of gold and orange, and the train car seemed to fit perfectly among them. The rust that once made it look ugly now gave it a rustic charm, blending beautifully with the season. It was during this time that a local builder visited. He'd heard about Ethan's project and wanted to see it for himself. "I gotta say," the man told him, looking around, "you've done something special here. Most folks would have torn this thing apart for scrap. You turned it into a home." Ethan laughed lightly. "It's been a lot of work." "I bet," the man replied. "But it's worth it. You've got vision." The builder offered to help him with a few structural improvements at a low cost. Together, they reinforced the flooring and added a small wooden porch that led to the entrance. The porch wasn't big, but it changed everything. It made the train car feel like a real home, a place meant to be lived in, not just visited. As the weeks passed, more people from town stopped by, some bringing small gifts or supplies. What began as curiosity turned into quiet admiration. Ethan didn't ask for help, but people wanted to be part of what he was creating. It reminded them that beauty can come from the most unexpected places. Even the kids who used to tease him about living in junk started helping out. They handed him tools, swept the floor, or painted small sections. In return, he told them stories about old trains and how they used to connect towns and people. They listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing a piece of history come alive. By late autumn, the inside of the train car was nearly complete. Ethan built a small sleeping loft above the kitchen area, with a wooden ladder leading up to it. He added curtains made from fabric he found at a thrift store, and when he hung them up, the space felt warm and private. He even made a small writing desk near one of the windows, where he could sit and jot down thoughts or plans. At night, the train car glowed softly from the light of his handmade lamps. If you drove past on the road nearby, you'd see it shining gently in the darkness, surrounded by quiet fields. Some people said it looked like something out of a painting, but the most beautiful thing about it wasn't just how it looked. It was how it made people feel. One evening, an elderly woman stopped by. She lived alone in town and said she'd lost her husband years ago. She told Ethan that watching him work had inspired her to fix up her own small home again. "I was ready to give up on everything," she said, her eyes soft with tears. "But you reminded me that it's never too late to rebuild something you love." Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being anyone's inspiration. He had simply been trying to survive. But at that moment, he realized that his project had become something more. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about hope. As winter approached, he prepared the train car for the cold. He installed a small, efficient wood stove and stacked firewood along the side of the building. The smell of burning wood soon filled the air, wrapping the space in warmth and comfort. He would sit there at night wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames dance. The wind howled outside, but inside everything felt calm. The creak of the metal walls, the hum of the stove, the soft glow of light. It was all part of the rhythm of his new life. One night, as snow began to fall, Ethan stood at the doorway and looked out at the quiet landscape. The train car, now polished and alive, reflected the faint light of the moon. Snowflakes settled on its roof, melting slowly into tiny silver droplets. He smiled. The same rusty shell that had once been mocked by everyone was now a home that even strangers admired. And though he still had more to do, new plans, new dreams, he felt content for the first time in years. It wasn't about the fame or the curiosity it brought. It was about peace, about knowing that even when life falls apart, you can still build something beautiful out of the ruins. And as the snow continued to fall softly that night, the world around him seemed still and quiet, almost as if the train car itself was resting after a long, hard journey. Ethan took one last look before closing the door, feeling grateful for every challenge, every doubt, and every step that led him here. He didn't know it yet, but the best part of his story was still to come. Winter slowly gave way to spring again. The snow melted, revealing the land around the train car, which now looked completely different from when Ethan first arrived. The once empty field was full of life. Small green plants sprouted near the porch, birds sang from nearby trees, and the sound of the breeze against the metal roof was no longer lonely. It had been almost 2 years since he bought that rusty old train car, and standing there now, it was hard to believe how far things had come. The same people who used to laugh when they drove by now slowed down to admire what it had become. What once looked like a forgotten piece of scrap metal was now a beautiful little home, glowing with warmth and creativity. Ethan had poured his heart into every corner of the place. From the polished wooden walls to the tiny loft bed above the kitchen, every detail had a story. The deck outside had been extended with help from a few friends he'd made in town, and he had even planted a small garden nearby. Nothing fancy, just herbs and a few flowers. But to him, it was a symbol of how much life had grown around something everyone once thought was worthless. He often woke up early just to watch the sunrise from his porch. The golden light would stretch across the field and spill into the train car, filling it with warmth. With a cup of coffee in his hand and the quiet hum of the morning around him, he felt a peace that words couldn't describe. One morning, while he was cleaning the porch, a car pulled up near the entrance. It was a reporter from a larger news outlet who had seen the story about him in the small-town newspaper months earlier. She stepped out, smiled, and said, "Are you the man who turned a train car into a home?" Ethan laughed softly. "That's me." She looked around, amazed. "I have to say, this is even more beautiful in person. Would you mind if we filmed a short piece about your story? I think people would love to see it." He hesitated for a moment. He was never the kind of person who liked attention. But he realized that this wasn't just about showing off. It was about sharing something meaningful. Maybe his story could help others believe in their own second chances. So he agreed. A week later, a small camera crew arrived. They filmed the outside of the train car, capturing the soft light reflecting off the metal and the gentle sway of the grass around it. Then they filmed inside, his handmade furniture, the shelves filled with books and tools, the cozy bed under the wooden ceiling. During the interview, the reporter asked him, "When you first started this, everyone thought you were crazy. What made you keep going?" Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "At first, I didn't have much left to lose. I just needed something to focus on, something to rebuild even if no one understood. But after a while, it stopped being just a project. It became a way of healing. Every nail, every board, every small detail, it all gave me a sense of purpose again." The video went online a few days later. It spread faster than he expected. People from different towns, even other countries, started watching and sharing it. Comments poured in, messages of support, admiration, and inspiration. Some people wrote things like, "I needed this today. Thank you for reminding me not to give up." Others said, "This man is proof that beauty can come from anything." Ethan read those messages one by one, overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. He never imagined that something so personal would touch so many people. Before long, more visitors started showing up at his little property. Some were travelers passing through. Others were people who had seen the video and wanted to meet him. A few even asked for advice on how to build their own tiny homes. Ethan welcomed them all with a smile. He would pour them coffee, show them around, and share stories of the challenges he faced. He never acted like a teacher or an expert. He just spoke honestly about his journey, the mistakes, the lessons, the small victories, and people appreciated that. They said it made them believe that starting over was possible. The train car, once a forgotten piece of rust, had become a symbol of creativity and hope. But even with all the attention, Ethan stayed humble. He still worked every day, improving small details around the home. He built a rainwater system to collect and reuse water, installed more solar panels to stay completely off-grid, and even made a small fire pit outside where visitors could sit in the evenings. Sometimes, when he sat by that fire under the stars, he thought about how strange life could be. 2 years ago, he was struggling to find direction, feeling lost and broken. Now his life was full of purpose, full of peace, and full of people who believed in him. One day, a letter arrived in his small mailbox. It was from a community college in a nearby city. They had seen his story online and wanted to invite him to give a short talk to their architecture students about sustainable living and creative design. At first, he laughed at the idea. "I'm not a designer," he told himself. But then he thought about all the people who had helped him, all the lessons he'd learned along the way. Maybe he didn't have fancy degrees or professional titles, but he had something real, experience. So he agreed to go. When he arrived at the college, he felt nervous. He wasn't used to speaking in front of people, but as he began to talk, something shifted. He told the students about how he started with nothing but a broken dream and a rusty train car. He talked about how people laughed at first, how he almost gave up, and how every small step mattered. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment, then everyone began to clap. Some students even came up afterward to thank him. One of them said, "You made me realize that creativity isn't about money or tools. It's about seeing possibilities where others see waste." That simple comment stayed with him. As months passed, more opportunities opened up. He began holding small weekend workshops back home, teaching people how to reuse materials and design small, affordable spaces. The first few classes were small, just a handful of people, but soon more and more came. They weren't just there to learn about construction. They came to hear his story, to feel encouraged, to remember that it's okay to start over. Through it all, Ethan never stopped improving his own home. He added a small reading nook near one window and a hidden storage space under the bed. Every change made the place more comfortable and personal. Sometimes when he walked around the yard at sunset, he'd stop and look at the train car glowing in the fading light. The warm colors of evening reflected off the polished metal, and the sound of crickets filled the air. He'd think about that first day when he stood here, surrounded by rust and doubt. How far away that day seemed now. He had learned that rebuilding your life doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, one choice, one effort, one act of faith at a time. But not everyone could see the full picture yet. Some people still passed by and thought, "Oh, it's just a train car." They didn't know the story behind it, the long nights, the mistakes, the perseverance, the hope. Those who did know, though, saw something more. They saw what determination could do. They saw what belief could build. As another summer began, the area around his land bloomed with color again. The garden grew taller, bees buzzed among the flowers, and the scent of fresh earth filled the air. Visitors continued to come, and Ethan welcomed them all. Some stayed just for a few minutes, others for hours, sitting quietly and soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. One evening, after everyone had gone and the sky had turned orange with sunset, Ethan sat on his porch and thought about everything that had happened. He smiled to himself, realizing that what began as a simple idea, to rebuild an old train car, had turned into something much bigger. It had become a story that connected people, a reminder that even the most broken things can be transformed with enough care and vision. He didn't need applause or fame. What mattered was knowing that he'd turned something abandoned into something alive. And in doing so, he had rebuilt himself. The man who once stood alone in front of a rusted train car was now surrounded by light, laughter, and hope. And though his journey wasn't over yet, he finally understood something he hadn't before. Sometimes, what looks like the end of the line is really just the beginning of a new track. The soft sound of rain tapping against the metal roof filled the quiet of the evening. The air was cool and smelled fresh, carrying that familiar scent of wet earth that always made Ethan feel calm. He sat near the window, watching the drops slide down the glass. Inside the train car, the warm light from a small lamp painted golden patterns on the wooden walls. It felt peaceful, like the world outside could wait. So much had changed in 3 years. The rusty shell that once looked abandoned had become something full of life and meaning. And in that same time, Ethan had changed too. The man who once carried the weight of loss and uncertainty now carried something lighter, a sense of peace that came from creating something with his own hands. He looked around at the space he'd built, remembering how it had all started. Every part of the train car had a story. The shelf near the door was made from the wood of an old barn that had been torn down nearby. The desk in the corner was built from scrap pieces he once found behind a hardware store. Even the light fixture hanging above him had been crafted from an old lantern he discovered in a junkyard. Each piece was a memory, a lesson, a reminder that even broken things could be made beautiful again. As the rain continued to fall, Ethan took a sip of tea and smiled to himself. Outside, the lights he'd hung around the porch glowed softly through the drizzle. The garden had grown thick and green again, and the wooden path leading to the front steps looked almost like something from a dream. He still received letters and messages from people who had seen his story online. Many of them were from strangers, people who had been inspired by what he did and decided to take a step toward their own dreams. Some shared pictures of tiny homes they built, or gardens they started, or even old things they had restored instead of throwing away. Every message made him feel grateful. He didn't do any of this for attention, but knowing that his story gave others hope meant everything to him. One day, while he was checking his small mailbox, he found a letter from a man who lived several states away. The letter was written by hand, a little messy but full of emotion. It said, "Your story gave me the courage to rebuild my father's old fishing cabin instead of selling it. Thank you for reminding me that some things are worth saving." Ethan read that line several times. It made him realize that what he had built wasn't just a home, it was a message. A reminder that sometimes the most broken places can hold the most beautiful stories. Later that week, a young couple drove by and stopped at his gate. They had seen his videos and wanted to meet him in person. The man stepped out first, holding an umbrella, and said, "We just wanted to say thank you. We watched your story during a really hard time, and it gave us hope. We're building our own little place now." Ethan invited them in, made them tea, and showed them around. They walked slowly, asking questions about how he had done certain things, the insulation, the flooring, the rainwater system. But mostly they just looked around quietly, smiling. Before they left, the woman said, "This place feels alive. You can tell it was built with love." Ethan nodded softly. "That's all I wanted," he said, "for it to feel alive again." After they drove away, he stood for a while on the porch, watching the rain ease into a light drizzle. The sky began to clear and the smell of wet grass filled the air. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet sense of completion. But life still had surprises waiting. A few months later, a letter arrived from the town council. They were planning to open a small community park nearby and wanted to feature a section dedicated to creative, sustainable living. They asked if Ethan would consider designing a small public space using his unique style, a reading nook made from repurposed materials, maybe even a mini shelter shaped like a train car. At first, the idea scared him a little. He had built everything in his life alone. The thought of creating something for the public, for strangers to use and enjoy, felt much bigger than anything he had done before. But after thinking about it for a few days, he said yes. He worked slowly, just like before, gathering old wood, sanding metal pieces, and sketching designs late into the night. This time, though, he didn't work in silence. Some of his new friends from the town came to help. They brought tools, materials, and sometimes just their company. They shared laughs, stories, and food while working side by side. The project took months, but when it was done, it felt like magic. The small reading space stood near the park's entrance, built partly from an old rail car door and decorated with wood patterns that matched Ethan's home. Inside were benches made from reclaimed planks, a shelf for donated books, and soft lighting powered by solar panels. When the park officially opened, people gathered around to see it. Children ran in and out of the structure, laughing and playing. Parents sat on the benches, reading or talking quietly. A few older folks stood at a distance, nodding with appreciation. Someone asked Ethan to say a few words, and though he didn't prepare anything, he stepped forward and spoke from the heart. "I never planned for any of this," he said. "I just wanted to give an old train car another chance. But along the way, I learned something important. Sometimes we all need a second chance. And when we decide to build, to fix, to believe again, it doesn't just change what's in front of us, it changes who we are." The crowd clapped, and for a moment Ethan felt his eyes sting with quiet emotion. After the event, he walked back home slowly, taking the long way through the fields. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, and the faint sound of the town celebrating in the distance made him smile. When he reached his train car, he stopped and looked at it. The metal glowed in the warm light, and the reflection of the sunset shimmered on its surface. He ran his hand along the smooth steel, feeling the cool texture beneath his fingers. "This old thing," he said softly to himself. "Who would have thought?" He walked inside, lit a small lantern, and sat at his desk. On it lay a notebook filled with sketches, measurements, and ideas. But on the last page he had written something different, just a few words that captured everything he'd learned. "Home isn't what you find, it's what you make." He closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the faint creak of the train car in the evening breeze. The air was peaceful, and the world outside was quiet. Over time, more people began to build their own projects inspired by his work. Some wrote to tell him about tiny homes, others about converted buses or small cabins built from old barns. He always replied, encouraging them to keep going. Years later, when the paint on his train car had faded just a little and the garden had grown wild and colorful around it, people still came to visit. Not to see a famous place, but to feel something, a reminder that creativity, hope, and persistence could turn the most unlikely thing into something extraordinary. Sometimes they found him sitting on the porch, carving wood or reading. And when they asked him how he had done it, he would smile and say, "One small step at a time." That's how everything begins. In the end, the man who once stood alone in a field, mocked for buying a rusty train car, had built far more than a home. He had built a life filled with meaning, a story that stretched far beyond the walls of metal and wood. He had proved that dreams don't always start in perfect places. Sometimes they start in the most broken ones. And as the last light of day faded behind the horizon, the train car stood strong and shining, not as a forgotten relic of the past, but as a living symbol of what belief and persistence can create.